In this video, I'm going to offer a brief commentary around a well-known and important public letter, that written by the US civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1963, and now generally known as his letter from Birmingham jail. Some of you may have heard of this, even if you've not yet had the chance to read it. In order to encourage you all to do so, we will also post a link below this video where you can easily access an online version of the letter. Now, for the benefit of everyone, this letter is today generally regarded as an American classic. It's been long republished in school and college anthologies and textbooks, and the British historian Adam Fairclough refers to it as one of the best known statements of civil disobedience to come out of the civil rights movement. This video, which will be quite short, is being made in conjunction with the American Studies Program's schools competition, Letters to a President, and the video has two aims. Firstly, through the competition, we want to enrich and to extend the stock of examples of letters that you have access to, that you know about and are able to study in your classrooms. Secondly, we want to use some of these examples also perhaps to identify some stylistic techniques and conventions that prominent figures have used in their own letter writing, in the hope that perhaps it gives shape or inspiration to your own future entries to our competition. Now, as I've said, the video is going to be quite brief. I'll confine my remarks to about 8 minutes or so, and it will be organized in this way. In a moment, we'll consider the context of this letter. In other words, when was it written and what else was going on? Then we'll move to consider the contents of King's letter. What does King say in it? Thirdly, and perhaps a little grandly, we'll then turn to consider the rhetorical and stylistic conventions of the letter. In other words, how does he say what he says? And fourthly, and with one eye on those of you perhaps studying letter writing or different forms and conventions in your classes for English language and literature, I'll then pose some questions at the end about the particular letter that might also be of wider interest to those, for instance, studying the US civil rights movement in history classes. A letter from Birmingham jail was written in April 1963 by Dr. King following his arrest in the city of Birmingham, Alabama. He was arrested ostensibly for marching without a legal permit. Now, he was in Birmingham, Alabama, in order to help desegregate that downtown of a city widely known as America's most segregated. This campaign was happening at a pivotal and really decisive moment for the civil rights movement. From the mid-1950s on, growing numbers of African Americans had mobilized, and legal victories in America's courtrooms had galvanized this movement. The sit-ins that began and engulfed southern cities in the spring of 1960, for instance, were an equally transformative chapter, as the legal scholar Chris Schmidt has recently reminded us. Yet 1962 was a year of significant setbacks. The movement had begun to be beset by internal rivalry and tensions between groups and leaders. Secondly, in the latter part of 1962, in the city of Albany, Georgia, the movement had seemingly faltered, unable to dent and puncture that city's segregated structures. Finally, by early 1963, just weeks before King was arrested in Birmingham, the 3 million readers of Time magazine learned that King was now a man in the middle, fast losing status among young people. Just to say then that the stakes were really high at the moment when King was sitting down to compose his letter. Now, as the title suggests, King's letter was written from his jail cell. He didn't have much access to paper. Indeed, many scholars have told us that he scribbled down his thoughts in the margins of a newspaper and eventually on scraps of paper that another African-American prisoner had been able to obtain. He drafted this letter over about 2 days during his stay in prison. and those thoughts were then passed through his lawyers to be typed up and eventually printed. As he remarks near the end, his letter would have been much shorter if I'd been writing from a comfortable desk. A typically witty, if pointed remark and reminder to his readers that he was writing from his jail cell. Now, like many letters, this one had been prompted by another, specifically a letter sent by local members of Birmingham's clergy to the local newspaper, criticizing civil rights groups for what they called their untimely and extreme measures, and pointedly criticizing King as an outsider. It would be to that letter that King's was ostensibly addressed. Now, there's much that we can say about the stylistic techniques that King employs in this letter. And if you are studying letter writing or composition and thinking about style and form, either for English literature or language at GCSE or A level, then I do encourage you to look further and much deeper than I'm able to now at King's letter. I'm just going to confine myself to two observations about this particular document. Firstly, I want us to notice how King addresses his audience. Now, remember, he's writing in response to another letter written by 8 local clergymen. And so it's for this reason, as you can see here, that he begins his own letter, "My dear fellow clergymen." This is clever because it establishes King as an equal of them, as a fellow theologian, but it also helps him to frame the rest of his letter as being the work of a clergyman engaged in social activism. And it's perhaps for this reason that some have called his letter a sermon, or better still, a liturgy. In other words, a type of document that's intended not only to address potential members of a movement, but to actually persuade them to join that movement. And so the idea of audience throughout this letter is really important. It's not only the 8 clergymen who'd criticized him publicly who he's addressing here, but he's using that as a device to open up a space to address many other audiences, including, as you can see here, crucially, what he terms white moderates. He begins to consider the apathy and indifference of this group that he calls white moderates. And it'd be for this reason that the historian Glenn Eskew remarks that King's letter was a beautifully crafted statement on the obligation of all moral men to support the rights of the oppressed. The second feature of King's letter that I would like to draw your attention to is the way in which it's generously sprinkled with references to theologians and moral philosophers. Now, King does this with a really deft touch. It's not bookish and learned, but it helps to give that letter its crisp momentum. Among those that he particularly draws upon are what he calls the Jewish prophets of the 8th century. Now, these biblical figures and texts had long been a source of inspiration, a touchstone for African-American preachers and public speakers. And those texts had generally helped to craft what we call a Jeremiad. In other words, public orations that are indignant and that call attention to the social inequities of the present moment. And when I reread King's letter in order to put together this video, I was really reminded, for instance, of the use that the 19th century statesman, former slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass makes of precisely these texts, a point brought out beautifully in Yale historian David Blight's recent study of Douglass, where he argues that these Jewish prophets provided what I think he calls Douglass's deepest well of metaphor and meaning. And similarly for King in this letter, the tradition established by these Jewish prophets also helps to give his letter its deeply ironic qualities. It's quite witty. So look at this passage, for example, where he contrasts the difference between the nations of Asia and Africa, which were moving with jet-like speed towards gaining political independence, but how in the United States we still creep at horse and buggy pace towards gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Finally, although King wrote his letter from Birmingham jail in Alabama, his words would resonate far and wide in 1963 and beyond. Indeed, it would be at this point that British newspapers would start to take a serious and sustained interest in him and the movement. In subsequent years, King and several other civil rights and Black Power leaders would even visit the United Kingdom. Now, although Martin Luther King never visited Birmingham, he briefly visited Newcastle and St. Paul's Cathedral in London. In 1964, Malcolm X did venture to the other Birmingham, as well as to Oxford, Manchester, and Sheffield. It's a final reminder that whilst our competition is asking and inspiring you to write letters to the United States today, it's also important to remember the way in which letters and words have flowed in past years in the other direction. I'll leave you with some final questions that you might take up and address in your respective subjects, whether that be American history or English literature, language, or politics.